Behind the scenes of this Bruce Willis buddy cop thriller lies one of Hollywood's most chaotic productions, featuring riot police, a composer who despised his own work, a stuffed cat packing heat, and helicopter blade carnage that earned MTV nominations. From script battles that destroyed friendships to a near riot at the Los Angeles Coliseum, the making of this film was arguably more explosive than anything that made it to screen. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about The Last Boy Scout. 1991. Fact 1. Original title was Die Hard. Before Bruce Willis ever crawled through air ducts or fought terrorists in a skyscraper, Shane Black had already claimed the title Die Hard for his own script. When Black first wrote what would eventually become The Last Boy Scout in the late 1980s, he called his buddy cop thriller Die Hard, completely unaware that this simple two-word title would soon become one of the most famous action movie names in Hollywood history. The story of how the title changed hands reads like something out of a Hollywood comedy. Producer Joel Silver, who had worked with Black on the hugely successful Lethal Weapon, was simultaneously developing another project called Nothing Lasts Forever, based on a 1979 novel by Roderick Thorpe. Silver read Black's script and loved the title Die Hard so much that he approached the young screenwriter with an unusual request. He asked if he could borrow the title for his own project about a New York cop trapped in a Los Angeles skyscraper during a terrorist attack. Black, who was still early in his career and eager to maintain his relationship with the powerful producer, agreed to let Silver use the title. This decision proved to be one of the most significant title swaps in movie history. Silver's Nothing Lasts Forever became Die Hard and launched Bruce Willis into action stardom in 1988, while Black's original script sat on the shelf for several more years. When Black's script finally made it to the screen in 1991, it needed a new name. The studio settled on The Last Boy Scout, which came from a line of dialogue in the film itself. Ironically, both movies ended up starring Bruce Willis, though in completely different types of roles. While Die Hard made Willis a wise-cracking everyman hero, The Last Boy Scout cast him as a cynical, burned-out private detective who chain smokes and trades insults with his reluctant partner. The title swap became even more interesting when you consider that both films were produced by Joel Silver and featured similar themes of corruption, violence, and unlikely heroes fighting against overwhelming odds. Fact 2. Record-breaking script sale triggered bidding war. Shane Black made Hollywood history when he sold The Last Boy Scout screenplay for $1,750,000, setting a new record for the highest amount ever paid for a spec script at that time. What makes this sale even more remarkable is that Black actually walked away from an even bigger payday to maintain his professional relationships in the industry. The bidding war for Black's script began on a Monday morning in 1990, when his agent submitted the screenplay to various studios across Hollywood. By Tuesday night, less than 48 hours later, multiple studios were competing fiercely for the rights to what would become one of the most expensive screenplays ever purchased. The script had everything Hollywood executives loved: explosive action sequences, snappy dialogue, and a buddy cop formula that had already proven successful with Black's previous work on Lethal Weapon. During the intense bidding process, one studio offered Black an astronomical $2,500,000 for his script, which would have shattered his own record by another $750,000. However, Black made the surprising decision to turn down this higher offer and instead accepted the lower bid from Geffen Pictures and Warner Brothers, who offered $1,750,000 with over $1 million guaranteed up front. Black's reasoning for leaving money on the table came down to personal relationships and creative control. He wanted to work with producer Joel Silver again, despite their sometimes difficult partnership on Lethal Weapon. Black explained his decision to New York Magazine in 1990, saying there was an expression that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. He believed that Silver understood his writing style, and that he could work with the people at Warner Brothers, even if he didn't always agree with their decisions. The record-breaking sale created a new benchmark for screenplay purchases and demonstrated just how valuable a well-crafted action script could be in the early 1990s. Black's decision to prioritize relationships over money would later prove both costly and beneficial, as the production became one of the most troubled in his career. Fact 3. Riot police called to control angry extras. The chaotic production of The Last Boy Scout reached its most dangerous point when hundreds of angry extras nearly rioted at the Los Angeles Coliseum, forcing the production team to call in riot police to restore order. This unprecedented incident occurred during the filming of the movie's climactic football stadium scenes, which required massive crowds to create the atmosphere of a professional football game. The trouble began when the production scheduled 2 days of shooting at the historic Los Angeles Coliseum to capture the football sequences that bookend the film. On the first day, hundreds of extras showed up as planned and successfully completed their scenes, filling the stadium seats to create the illusion of a packed NFL game. The production team told these extras to return the following day for additional crowd shots and reaction scenes, promising them another day's pay for their work. However, behind the scenes, the production team made a last-minute decision to cancel the second day of shooting due to budget concerns and scheduling conflicts. The problem was that nobody informed the extras about this change in plans. When hundreds of people arrived at the Coliseum the next morning expecting to work and earn their promised payment, they found the gates locked and no film crew in sight. As word spread through the crowd that the shooting had been canceled and they would not be paid for the lost day, anger began to build among the extras. Many of these people had rearranged their schedules, taken time off from other jobs, or traveled significant distances to be at the Coliseum. When production representatives finally arrived and confirmed that the extras would not receive compensation for the canceled day, the situation quickly escalated. The crowd of frustrated extras began to surge against the barriers that surrounded the film set, with some people shouting and demanding payment for their wasted time. As the situation grew more volatile and the crowd became increasingly aggressive, someone from the production team called the Los Angeles Police Department for assistance. Riot police officers arrived at the scene and had to disperse the angry crowd before the situation could turn into a full-scale riot. This incident became yet another example of how every aspect of The Last Boy Scout's production seemed to go wrong. Fact 4. Producer called it life's worst experience. Joel Silver, one of Hollywood's most powerful and successful producers, publicly declared that making The Last Boy Scout was one of the 3 worst experiences of his life, a shocking admission from someone who had produced massive hits like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and The Matrix trilogy. This statement came during a New Yorker profile where Silver spoke candidly about the nightmare production that nearly destroyed his professional relationships with both Bruce Willis and director Tony Scott. Silver's misery during the production stemmed from constant power struggles and creative battles that erupted on set almost daily. The producer found himself caught between Bruce Willis, who was at the height of his stardom following the success of Die Hard, and director Tony Scott, who had his own strong vision for the film. Both men frequently challenged Silver's authority and made demands that conflicted with each other, creating an impossible situation where Silver couldn't satisfy either of his key collaborators. The situation became so toxic that Willis and Silver took over significant portions of the production from Scott, forcing the director to shoot scenes he hated under the threat of being fired and losing his salary. This power grab created deep resentment from Scott, who later spoke about how miserable the production had become. The assistant director James Scotchdepole described the atmosphere on set as having an overabundance of alpha males, with Willis, Silver, Scott, and screenwriter Shane Black all having strong opinions about how the movie should be made. Silver's behavior during production became so erratic and controlling that crew members described him as insane, with long, horrible fits of sanity. One crew member compared him to a fighter pilot riding as a passenger, explaining that as soon as you hit a little bit of turbulence, he's right away going to throw the guy out of the window and take over the steering. The constant conflicts and Silver's heavy-handed approach to managing the production created such a hostile work environment that it poisoned relationships that had taken years to build. The Last Boy Scout marked the final collaboration between Silver and Willis, with their professional relationship never recovering from the damage done during those 90 days of filming between March and June of 1991. Fact 5. Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans hated each other. One of the most ironic aspects of The Last Boy Scout is that Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans, who played partners forced to work together on screen, reportedly despised each other in real life and could barely tolerate being in the same room during the 90-day production. Their mutual dislike created a tense atmosphere on set that made filming even more difficult than it already was. Yet somehow, their antagonistic relationship translated into believable chemistry between their characters. The conflict between Willis and Wayans began almost immediately. When production started in March of 1991, Willis, coming off the massive success of Die Hard and Die Hard 2, was at the peak of his Hollywood stardom and accustomed to having significant control over his projects. Wayans, meanwhile, was transitioning from his successful comedy career on Saturday Night Live and In Living Color to dramatic action roles, and he had his own strong opinions about how his character should be portrayed. Their personality clash became evident during their very first scenes together, where the natural friction between the actors created an authentic sense of two men who genuinely didn't want to be working together. While this tension actually served the story well, since their characters Joe Hallenbeck and Jimmy Dix are supposed to be reluctant partners who clash over everything from money to methods, it made the day-to-day filming process incredibly uncomfortable for everyone involved. The situation became so bad that crew members noticed the actors would avoid each other between takes and rarely spoke, unless they were actually filming their scene. When they did interact off-camera, their conversations were reportedly brief and strictly professional, with none of the joking or camaraderie that typically develops between co-stars during a long production. Director Tony Scott had to carefully manage their scenes together, sometimes filming their reactions separately to avoid having them in the same space for extended periods. Despite their personal animosity, both actors remained professional enough to deliver their performances, and their real-life dislike actually enhanced the believability of their characters' reluctant partnership. The film's success proved that sometimes authentic conflict between actors can create more compelling on-screen relationships than forced friendship. Fact 6. Mel Gibson was almost Jimmy Dix. The role of Jimmy Dix, the disgraced ex-football quarterback that eventually went to Damon Wayans, was originally intended for Mel Gibson, who would have created an entirely different dynamic for the film and reunited him with screenwriter Shane Black after their successful collaboration on Lethal Weapon. This casting choice would have fundamentally changed the character from a young, cocky athlete struggling with addiction to something closer to Gibson's typical hard-edged action hero persona. During the early development stages in 1990, when the project was still being shaped and various directors were attached, Gibson was seriously considered for the role of the former Los Angeles Stallions quarterback. At that time, Richard Donner was set to direct the film, which would have created a Lethal Weapon reunion between Gibson, Black, and Donner. The original casting plan also included Jack Nicholson in the role of Joe Hallenbeck, the burned-out private detective that eventually went to Bruce Willis. Gibson's involvement would have created a very different tone for the film, as his screen presence tends toward intense, morally conflicted characters rather than the more comedic and street-smart personality that Wayans brought to Jimmy Dix. The character would likely have been written as an older, more weathered former athlete, probably someone whose career ended due to injury rather than gambling and drug problems. Gibson's natural intensity would have paired differently with the cynical private eye character, potentially creating more of a traditional buddy cop dynamic. However, by the time production actually began in 1991, the entire creative team had changed. Richard Donner was no longer directing. Jack Nicholson had moved on to other projects, and Tony Scott had taken over as director with Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans as the new leads. This casting change proved crucial to the film's identity, as Wayans brought a completely different energy to the role that emphasized comedy and verbal sparring rather than the grittier approach Gibson might have taken. The shift from Gibson to Wayans also reflected Hollywood's changing approach to buddy cop films, moving away from pairing two similar action stars toward mixing different types of performers to create more unexpected chemistry. Fact 7. Child actor wielded real .357 Magnum props. One of the most unusual and potentially controversial moments during the last Boy Scouts production involved 13-year-old Danielle Harris handling a real Smith & Wesson model 66 .357 Magnum revolver that was hidden inside a stuffed cat puppet during one of the film's most memorable scenes. This bizarre prop setup created one of the movie's most talked-about moments while raising questions about child safety protocols on Hollywood sets in the early 1990s. In the scene, Harris's character Darian Hallenbeck retrieves the powerful handgun from her father's car glove compartment and conceals it inside her stuffed animal puppet before handing it to Bruce Willis's character during a tense confrontation with armed criminals. The prop department had to carefully modify the real firearm to ensure Harris's safety while maintaining the authenticity needed for the close-up shots. The gun was fitted with special Pochmare presentation grips and had its firing mechanism disabled, but it was still a genuine .357 Magnum rather than a lightweight replica. The technical challenges of filming this sequence were significant, as the prop team had to create a hole in the stuffed cat that was large enough for the gun's barrel to fit through without damaging the puppet or creating safety hazards. When the scene required Willis to actually fire the weapon through the puppet, the hole had to be considerably widened so that the muzzle of the gun was completely clear of the fabric, preventing the blank ammunition's flame from burning the puppet or setting it on fire. Harris, who was already an experienced child actor known for her roles in the Halloween horror films, handled the unusual prop requirements professionally, despite the weapon's intimidating size and weight. The Model 66, with its 2.5-inch barrel, was a substantial piece of equipment for a young teenager to manipulate safely, especially while performing the precise movements required for the scene. The Internet Movie Firearms Database later documented this scene in detail, noting how the production team managed to balance the need for realistic props with child safety requirements. The sequence became one of the film's most memorable moments, combining dark comedy with genuine tension, as a 13-year-old girl casually hands her father a concealed weapon during a life-threatening situation. Fact 8. Composer Michael Kamen hated the film. Michael Kamen, the acclaimed composer behind the scores for Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and Robin Hood: Prince of Thieves, openly admitted that he hated The Last Boy Scout when he first saw the finished film, despite having created what many consider to be an excellent musical score for the production. This unusual situation created an awkward professional dynamic where one of Hollywood's most respected composers had to promote and discuss a soundtrack for a movie he genuinely disliked. Kamen's involvement in The Last Boy Scout came about purely through his personal relationships rather than any enthusiasm for the project itself. As Joel Silver's go-to composer during the late 1980s and early 1990s, Kamen had worked extensively with the producer on multiple successful action films, creating a professional partnership that had proven highly profitable for both men. Additionally, Kamen had developed a friendship with Bruce Willis during their collaboration on the Die Hard films, making it difficult for him to turn down the project when both Silver and Willis requested his participation. When Kamen finally saw the completed film, his reaction was immediate and negative. The composer felt that the final product had strayed too far from the original vision, and that the extensive re-editing and post-production problems had damaged the story's coherence and emotional impact. Despite his personal feelings about the movie, Kamen maintained his professionalism and delivered a full orchestral score that captured the film's noir atmosphere and action sequences. The composer's approach to scoring a film he disliked resulted in some interesting creative choices. Rather than trying to elevate or mask the material he found problematic, Kamen created music that matched the dark, cynical tone of the story. His score featured rumbling piano passages, explosive orchestral action cues, and suspenseful themes that perfectly complemented the on-screen violence and moral ambiguity, even though he personally disagreed with the film's direction. Kamen's honest assessment of the film became part of Hollywood folklore, demonstrating how even successful creative partnerships can produce work that satisfies professional obligations while leaving the artists personally unfulfilled. The score was eventually released by La La Land Records in 2015, decades after the original film. Fact 9. Originally rated NC-17 for violence, The Last Boy Scout's original cut was so brutally violent that the Motion Picture Association of America gave it an NC-17 rating, forcing the filmmakers to make significant cuts and re-edit numerous death scenes with quick, choppy editing to achieve the R rating necessary for wide theatrical release. This editing process explains why many of the film's most violent moments feel abruptly cut or strangely paced, as the editors had to remove graphic content while still maintaining the story's impact. The NC-17 rating was a serious problem for Warner Brothers because most major theater chains refused to show NC-17 films, and many newspapers and television stations wouldn't advertise them. This meant that keeping the original rating would have severely limited the film's box office potential and essentially killed its commercial prospects. The studio had invested too much money in the production to accept such a restricted release, so they demanded that the filmmakers find ways to tone down the violence without completely neutering the action sequences. The editing team faced the challenging task of removing some of the most graphic moments while preserving the intensity that made those scenes effective. They accomplished this by using rapid-fire editing techniques, cutting away from impacts at the last second, and shortening the duration of violent imagery. Some death scenes that originally showed extended, brutal detail were chopped into quick flashes that suggested the violence without lingering on the graphic results. These editorial changes are most noticeable in several key sequences, including the infamous scene where Bruce Willis's character punches a villain so hard that his nose is driven into his brain, and the climactic helicopter blade sequence where the main villain meets his gruesome end. In both cases, the quick cutting and shortened shots create a jarring viewing experience that feels more rushed than the filmmakers originally intended. The re-editing process became another source of frustration for director Tony Scott, who felt that the studio was forcing him to compromise his artistic vision for commercial reasons. Film critic Roger Ebert noted in his review that the film managed to earn an R rating despite its extreme violence, proving that violence alone could not earn an NC-17 rating if it was edited skillfully enough to meet the ratings board's standards. Fact 10. Tony Scott created villain based on Joel Silver. Tony Scott's frustration with producer Joel Silver during The Last Boy Scout reached such extreme levels that the director used his next film as an opportunity for creative revenge, basing the sleazy movie producer character Lee Donowitz in True Romance directly on Silver's physical appearance and obnoxious personality traits. This act of cinematic payback became one of Hollywood's most famous examples of a director publicly settling scores through character assassination on screen. The character of Lee Donowitz, played by Saul Rubinek in True Romance, was written and designed to be an unmistakable caricature of Joel Silver, complete with similar physical features, mannerisms, and professional behavior. Scott made sure that Donowitz looked and acted exactly like Silver. From his appearance and clothing style to his aggressive, controlling personality and his involvement in the cocaine trade, the character was portrayed as a morally corrupt Hollywood producer who uses drugs and intimidation to maintain his power in the entertainment industry. Scott's decision to create this unflattering portrait stemmed from his terrible experience working with Silver on The Last Boy Scout, where the producer had interfered with the director's creative vision and made the production process miserable for everyone involved. Scott later described Silver as insane, with long, horrible fits of sanity, and compared working with him to having a fighter pilot riding as a passenger who would throw the guy out of the window and take over the steering at the first sign of trouble. The Lee Donowitz character served multiple purposes in True Romance, beyond just personal revenge. The character represented Scott's broader critique of Hollywood's cocaine-fueled excess during the 1980s and early 1990s, embodying the worst aspects of producer culture during that era. The character's eventual violent death in the film could be seen as Scott's fantasy about what should happen to abusive producers who make filmmakers' lives miserable. Silver himself was reportedly aware of the connection between the character and his own persona, but he never publicly responded to Scott's cinematic insult. The incident became part of Hollywood folklore and demonstrated how creative disputes during one production could spill over into future projects in unexpected and highly personal ways. Fact 11. Multiple editors fired before release. The Last Boy Scouts post-production became a revolving door of frustrated editors when the original cut turned out to be what industry insiders described as borderline unwatchable, forcing Warner Brothers to hire and fire multiple editors before veteran Stuart Baird was finally brought in to salvage the film from what appeared to be certain disaster. This editing nightmare became one of the most extreme examples of a troubled production, requiring extensive post-production rescue work in Hollywood history. The problems began when director Tony Scott's tendency to film excessive coverage with multiple cameras created an overwhelming amount of raw footage that proved nearly impossible to assemble into a coherent narrative. Editor Mark Helfrich, who worked on the first cut, described having to sort through mountains of raw material, noting that there was more footage shot for The Last Boy Scout than on any film he had ever worked on. The sheer volume of material made it difficult to find the best performances and create smooth transitions between scenes. Making matters worse, Helfrich discovered that previous editors had already attempted to work on the footage, only to have their work rejected, taken apart, and put back into the daily reels. He recalled finding splices all over the place in the raw footage, indicating that multiple attempts had been made to edit the film before he was even hired. This created additional confusion as editors struggled to understand what had already been tried and what material was still available to use. The situation became so desperate that veteran action film editor Mark Goldblatt was brought in to attempt another rescue effort. However, Goldblatt later described the experience as one of the most frustrating jobs of his career and has generally declined to discuss the project in detail. In one podcast interview, he mentioned that several editors had been hired and fired before him, and that Warner Brothers had begun testing the movie with audiences before it was even completely finished. Finally, Stuart Baird was hired to completely re-edit the film from scratch. Baird had previously been brought in to save other troubled productions, including Tango and Cash and Demolition Man, making him the studio's go-to editor for impossible situations. When Baird arrived, the film finally took a positive turn and became the version that audiences eventually saw in theaters. Fact 12. Villain role written for different actor. The character of Sheldon Marcone, the corrupt football team owner who serves as the Last Boy Scout's main antagonist, was originally written specifically with Sorrel Book in mind, the beloved actor best known for playing the bumbling boss Hogg on the Dukes of Hazzard television series. However, when it came time for actual casting, the role went to Noble Willingham instead, creating a completely different interpretation of the villainous character than what screenwriter Shane Black had originally envisioned. Sorrel Book would have brought a very different energy to the role of Marcone, as the actor was known for his comedic timing and his ability to play corrupt authority figures who were more buffoonish than truly menacing. Book's Boss Hogg character had made him famous for portraying wealthy, scheming villains who were ultimately more incompetent than dangerous, relying on bumbling schemes rather than genuine intimidation to achieve their goals. This casting choice would have given the Last Boy Scouts villain a more comedic edge that might have balanced some of the film's darker elements. The reasons for the casting change from Book to Willingham remain unclear, though it's possible that Book's health may have been a factor in the decision. By the early 1990s, Book was limiting his workload primarily to animated shows and smaller film projects, which could have made him unavailable for the demanding shooting schedule of a major action film. Alternatively, the filmmakers may have decided during development that they wanted a more serious, threatening villain rather than the lighter approach that Book's casting would have suggested. Noble Willingham, who ultimately played Marcone, brought a completely different interpretation to the character. Willingham was known for playing more straightforward authority figures and serious dramatic roles, including his work as a Texas Ranger on the television series Walker, Texas Ranger. His portrayal of Marcone emphasized the character's ruthless business practices and genuine menace rather than any comedic elements, making him a more traditional action movie villain. The casting change demonstrates how a single role can dramatically alter a film's tone, as Book's version of Marcone would likely have made The Last Boy Scout feel more like a dark comedy than the gritty action thriller it ultimately became. Fact 13. Recycled dialogue from Lethal Weapon. One of the most memorable exchanges in The Last Boy Scout, where Joe Hallenbeck and Jimmy Dix argue about $650 pants, was actually recycled dialogue that Shane Black had originally written for the first Lethal Weapon film, but which never made it into that movie's final cut. This bit of witty banter found new life in The Last Boy Scout, demonstrating how screenwriters sometimes salvage good material from previous projects when it fits naturally into new stories. The conversation about expensive pants perfectly captures the class differences and mutual antagonism between Bruce Willis's working-class private detective and Damon Wayans' former professional athlete character. The dialogue works so well in The Last Boy Scout that most viewers would never suspect it originated from a completely different script written several years earlier for entirely different characters. Black's decision to reuse this material shows his practical approach to screenwriting and his reluctance to waste good dialogue that had been cut from previous projects. Shane Black had developed a reputation for writing sharp, memorable exchanges between mismatched partners, and the pants conversation exemplifies his talent for creating authentic-sounding arguments that reveal character personalities while advancing the story. The dialogue feels natural and spontaneous, even though it was carefully crafted to highlight the economic and social differences between the two main characters. Joe's reaction to Jimmy's expensive clothing choices reinforces his image as a down-on-his-luck investigator who resents the wealthy, while Jimmy's defensive response shows his sensitivity about his fallen status. The recycling of this dialogue also reflects the collaborative nature of Hollywood filmmaking, where good ideas often migrate between projects as writers, directors, and producers work together on multiple films. Black's willingness to reuse material from Lethal Weapon in The Last Boy Scout demonstrates how screenwriters often develop a bank of scenes, conversations, and character moments that can be adapted for different stories when the circumstances are right. This practice of repurposing unused material is common in Hollywood, where the pressure to create memorable dialogue and compelling character interactions often leads writers to revisit their archives of deleted scenes and unused scripts for inspiration. Fact 14. Major continuity error with stadium footage. The Last Boy Scout contains one of the most glaring continuity errors in action movie history, when the film's climactic football game, which is supposed to take place at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, features overhead aerial shots that clearly show San Diego painted in red, white, and blue letters across the end zone. This obvious mistake reveals that the production team used stock footage from an actual college football game to save money on expensive aerial photography, but failed to notice or address the geographic inconsistency. The error occurs during the final act when Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans infiltrate the stadium to rescue Willis's daughter and stop the villain's assassination plot. Throughout the sequence, the film establishes that the action is taking place at a Los Angeles Stallions home game at the Memorial Coliseum, with characters specifically mentioning the Los Angeles location multiple times. However, when the camera pulls back to show wide aerial views of the stadium and the surrounding action, the San Diego end zone markings are clearly visible to anyone paying attention. The footage was most likely taken from the Holiday Bowl, an annual college football game held in San Diego during mid-December, which would explain both the San Diego markings and the red, white, and blue color scheme typical of bowl game presentations. The production team probably acquired this aerial footage because shooting their own helicopter shots over a packed stadium would have been prohibitively expensive and logistically complicated, especially given the film's already troubled production and budget concerns. This type of cost-cutting measure was common in early 1990s filmmaking, when digital effects were not yet sophisticated enough to easily replace or modify such details in post-production. The editors likely hoped that audiences would be too focused on the action sequences to notice the geographical inconsistency, or that the aerial shots would pass by too quickly for viewers to read the end zone markings clearly. The mistake has since become a favorite discovery among movie trivia enthusiasts and continuity error collectors, representing a perfect example of how production shortcuts can create glaring inconsistencies that become more obvious with repeated viewings and the ability to pause and examine footage frame by frame. Fact 15. Shane Black's personal catharsis project. Shane Black wrote The Last Boy Scout during one of the darkest periods of his personal life, transforming his emotional pain from a devastating breakup into what he later described as a very cathartic experience that became one of the most intense and focused writing periods of his entire career. The screenplay emerged from a 2-year hiatus from Hollywood, during which Black had essentially withdrawn from both his professional and social life to process his grief and disappointment. Following the end of what Black called his first real love, the screenwriter found himself unable to engage with his normal writing routine or maintain his usual social connections within the entertainment industry. Instead of forcing himself to work on studio assignments or develop new projects for producers, Black allowed himself to retreat from Hollywood's demands and spend extended periods in complete solitude. During this self-imposed isolation, he would sometimes go 3 or 4 days speaking only a few words to other people, creating an almost monastic existence centered around reading paperbacks and smoking cigarettes. When Black finally felt ready to write again, he channeled all of his accumulated bitterness and emotional turmoil into creating the character of Joe Hallenbeck, the cynical and world-weary private detective who anchors The Last Boy Scout. The protagonist's disillusionment with life, his troubled marriage, and his general mistrust of other people clearly reflected Black's own psychological state during this period. Writing the script became a way for Black to process his feelings about betrayal, loneliness, and the general corruption he perceived in both personal relationships and society at large. Black later reflected that his focus during this writing period was better than it had ever been before or since, describing the experience as wonderfully intense, despite the emotional pain that fueled it. The isolation and introspection that had initially seemed like creative paralysis actually became the source of his most personal and emotionally honest work. When he finally completed the script and sold it for the record-breaking price of $1,750,000, Black felt that the financial success represented both a vindication of his talent and proof that he was back on track professionally after his period of personal crisis.